One of the most influential stories of revolution of our time is about pirates. More specifically, it's a comic book about a boy made of rubber. One Piece is one of the most widely consumed stories in the world. Ichiro Oda, the author, started publishing One Piece in 1997, and the story is still ongoing. In 2022, One Piece was crowned the best-selling comic series ever and earned a Guinness World Record for most copies published for the same comic book series by a single author. All this to say that One Piece has reached a global audience that spans generations, cultures, and languages. It's become more than just a story. It's become something people can identify with. But why does a fictional pirate story resonate so deeply with people facing real world problems? Well, to answer that, first we need to define what One Piece is and what One Piece isn't. Despite being a pirate story, One Piece isn't about plundering villages or finding treasures. At its core, it's about freedom, the ability to live without being restricted or controlled by someone else. And it isn't really about pirates either, it's more about systems of power. In One Piece, there is a global ruling force known as the world government. On the surface, they are the good guys. They wear white coats, they speak in the language of justice, and they claim to protect order. But as the story unfolds, the readers begin to notice something unsettling. These so called protectors of justice are preserving slavery, suppressing truth, and maintaining their power by controlling the narrative, framing themselves as inherently just and anyone who opposes them as inherently evil. They even go so far as to ban their own history, making the pursuit of certain knowledge punishable by death. Now, this may sound extreme, but this story isn't meant to help us escape reality. It reflects it, and that reflection reveals something important. Our culture is in motion. For a long time, authority was something people trusted by default. Loyalty to institutions was tied to a sense of order, stability, and identity. But gradually, we've shifted from this blind trust to a more morally skeptical society. Today, authority is questioned when it appears unjust. Modern institutions are increasingly expected to earn their legitimacy. This is what sociologist Max Weber defines as authority that must be perceived as right in order to function. In One Piece, authority is never treated as inherently just. Power figures must constantly prove themselves through their actions and ideals, and when they don't, the story invites us to question them. That skepticism didn't emerge in isolation, it grew alongside another major shift: how power itself is organized. Before the internet, we lived in a centralized society. Most people received information from the same handful of television channels or newspapers. Influence flowed from the top down. But today, information moves across networks, being shared, reshaped, and amplified by millions of individuals. No single voice fully controls the narrative anymore. And as power and trust have changed, so have our values. Increasingly, people are less willing to accept profit and efficiency as the highest goals. We question where products come from, who is affected, and what is sacrificed in the process. One Piece consistently prioritizes loyalty, dignity, and the protection of the vulnerable over wealth, order, or convenience. One Piece didn't create these values, but it does embody them, giving audiences a language to recognize and talk about them. So, why does this feel revolutionary? Well, this desire to revolt mainly exists because there is an increasing gap between the power held by institutions and the people they serve. As this gap widens, institutions begin to feel untouchable, too big to fail, too distant to hold accountable, creating a growing sense of powerlessness. Protests have only been getting larger, but the impact they have on an institution's behavior often remains unchanged. It creates this feeling that the system isn't listening, not because it can't, but because it doesn't have to. Modern revolutions don't start with violence, they start with disillusionment, the growing disbelief in the systems created by the people for the people. And this is where One Piece becomes something more than just entertainment. The patterns displayed in One Piece are not just story or character arcs, they appear throughout our world today, often reflecting real world values. In One Piece, authority doesn't collapse the moment it's challenged, it collapses the moment it's exposed as unjust. Power is never treated as sacred by default, it only holds as long as people believe it deserves to. Once that moral legitimacy cracks, obedience begins to disappear, not because someone ordered a rebellion, but because belief quietly erodes. This mirrors how power functions in the modern world. Institutions use rely less on force than on trust, credibility, and public perception. Once people stop believing in the story power tells about itself, control weakens, even if the institution still exists on paper. Another shift One Piece emphasizes is the power of memory. In the story, knowledge itself is treated as dangerous. Certain histories aren't just forgotten, they're actively erased because the remembering of them threatens the legitimacy of those in power. This isn't revolutionary because history is important. We already know that. It's revolutionary because it tells us that whoever controls the past dictates what kind of future is possible. We see this same struggle today. Modern movements fight not just over policy change, but over narratives, over whose stories get told, whose pain is acknowledged, and whose past is allowed to exist. In both cases, remembering becomes a form of resistance. One Piece also rejects the idea that meaningful change comes from replacing one leader with another. There is no single leader of resistance, no centralized revolution waiting to seize control. Change occurs through individual actors acting independently but in the same direction by shared values. This mirrors how modern movements function. Power doesn't flow in straight lines, it moves through networks. Influence spreads through connection, shared language, and collective recognition rather than formal hierarchy. In a world like this, centralized control becomes fragile, but decentralized alignment, many people moving independently in the same direction, becomes incredibly powerful. In One Piece, the most radical actors don't try to change the system from the inside. They exist outside of it, not because they reject rules entirely, but because they refuse to participate in a system they believe is fundamentally unjust. We see these same impulses today. People create alternative communities, independent media, and parallel systems of support, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of survival or self definition. The revolution here isn't about overthrowing power, it's about redefining what kind of life is worth living. Around the world, people have carried symbols from One Piece into the real world. On posters, flags, protest signs, not because the story tells them what to overthrow, but because it gives them a language. A language to question authority that demands obedience without trust. A language to remember what power would rather erase. A language to imagine what freedom looks like when systems no longer feel humane. This is how One Piece has become the face of modern revolution, not by telling us what to overthrow, but by showing us where culture is. Culture always moves before laws do. And One Piece is showing us where culture is already at. Thank you.